Well, welcome everyone. We tried to schedule this to get a global audience, and it looks like we might have succeeded at that. And I'm thrilled because it's a crucial topic. As most of you know, war is back after many, many years of decline. We're starting to see an uptick again in civil war and also in wars such as Russia's war in Ukraine. And in the wake of COVID, we're also seeing the state pulling back from many areas with schools closed and unemployment growing. Gang and rebel group activity has grown, and violence between organized groups in the Americas, in South Africa, and a whole series of countries has also been up. So Chris's book, Why We Fight, tries to answer the question of why violence between groups breaks out and what can be done about it. So I'm going to introduce Chris and then jump right in. But I really want to encourage you, please put your questions throughout. I will do my best to remember a couple of times throughout this to remind you to send questions, but just send questions anytime. We'll try our best to get to them throughout the conversation, not just at the end. So for those who don't know Chris Blattman, he is the Romilly Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at University of Chicago. He co-leads the university's Development Economics Center, also the International Policy and Development Program at the Harris School. He's a research affiliate at the University of Chicago's Crime and Inclusive Economy Lab. He co-leads the Crime and Violence Initiative for the MIT's Poverty Action Lab, which is the real empirically focused kind of RCT-based way of looking at development interventions. He's also an associate at the Peace and Recovery Program for the NGO Innovations for Poverty Action. But he's a real academic in addition to all of the policy work. Before UChicago, he was an associate professor at Columbia. Before that, an assistant professor at Yale. And he also keeps a hand at the national policy level at the National Bureau of Economic Research. So it's fair to say that Chris spends a vast amount of time thinking about violence, crime, and economics. And I think we have a lot to learn from the book he's written about this. Now, Chris, I was trying to put together your bio before this talk, and I saw that you started out working at Kentucky Fried Chicken, then at Deloitte and Touche. I began my career working in mixed income housing development in New York City. But we both had sort of moments of awakening. Mine when I was in India studying microloans and development and just came across the ways that violence was being used to affect economic development by landlords, by rebel groups, and so on. You wrote about your awakening in Uganda. Can you talk a little bit about what motivated you to write this book and what motivated you to look into violence in general?
Thanks. Yeah, I started off, my early awakening was actually growing up in Canada, getting interested in issues of inequality there, and then maybe reflecting on that and realizing, well, actually, the inequality, there's a lot of Canadians working on this, and B, it doesn't seem that bad compared to what's going on in other parts of the world.
I was going to say, to an American, the inequality in Canada is
exactly. No. So it was a quick leap. It was a quick leap to, okay, there's a lot of inequality in the world. And so I got interested in that, and I, like a good young development economist, I was studying poverty, first in India, then East Africa. And then I got waylaid, and that's sort of how I opened the book, which is someone stole my laptop. I ended up in an internet cafe. I started chatting with a woman who was working in an active conflict in northern Uganda, followed her there. And we ended up working together. We're now married. We have 2 children. So that was a terrific chance of meeting, but it also set me on this career where, once you have talked to someone whose 12-year-olds gets kidnapped, or they wake up every night wondering, there's basically like a 1 in 10 chance my 12-year-old's going to get kidnapped this week. Or everybody's forcibly displaced from their homes. Or, I don't know, you can just look what's going on in Ukraine right now, and just this horrible cost, not just for Ukrainians, not just for Russians, really the whole world is feeling this. So it became very hard to focus on anything else. And so that's been, I don't know, almost 20 years now. And so I guess this book is like the consequence of that obsession, and maybe a frustration that a lot of the things I've been learning, this isn't really a book about my ideas. This is a book about everything that's been given to us the last 50, 60, 100 years from all different social scientists and policymakers. And it wasn't getting out there. And so I said, well, I'm going to put this together.
And I think generations of students are going to thank you for that, because it's really brilliantly written and a really beautiful book. But I want to underline that you're not just talking about war. You're really creating a theory for fighting of organized groups at any level, including war, but also mafias and so on. When I wrote A Savage Order, I workshopped it, I murder boarded it, that's what you call it. I murder boarded it with a bunch of academics at Stanford, but from all over. And I did something similar, putting different kinds of violence together. And I must say that was not the preferred way that academics like to treat violence.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in why you decided to treat these different kinds of organized violence alike, and what you do when someone says, but war is special. There's something different about violence from a country that just can't be compared to gang violence or mafia violence.
So these are different kinds of violence. I wake up in the morning and I'm also, a pointy-headed academic. And so my job, for 10 years, I studied civil wars, and we dive down and we really understand maybe what's specific about this. And then for the last 6, 7, 8 years, I've been focusing a lot on organized crime, and you dive down and you focus on what's special, but you also learn from what things have in common. And as it turns out, we could widen the scope even further. A lot of the insights we have into conflict, into war between nations or between villages, whatever level you want to bring it to, a lot of that theoretical apparatus comes from the study of labor strikes and from the study of court battles. Anytime we fail to resolve our dispute in a more efficient or amicable way, I think we can learn a lot from these things. So yeah, let's as academics dive down and figure out what's special about all these kinds of conflict. But then occasionally, let's sort of pull our heads up and see, what do all these things have in common? I personally found the lessons I've learned from one level have transformed how I think about the other levels. And that's kind of what I want to bring in the book.
I think it's terrific. One thing that you do early on is basically point out that the entire field of war studies has been making the most basic social science error, selecting on the dependent variable, or having a strong selection bias to be less pointy about it. It's one of those things you're taught not to do in first-year stats class. But if you look at a group of countries at war and you say they all have, mountains in common, they all have poverty in common. And we create these huge data sets to look at war and look at what these countries have in common. We forget to look at all the countries that might have that factor in common and are not at war. And so you actually say all of these correlations that the field has been finding might be somewhat accurate as correlation, but they're certainly not causal. Mountains are not causing war, and neither is poverty. And you're looking at an entirely different kind of level of analysis. Another thing that you're doing here, and there's a question at the end of this one, is you talk about a bias toward peace, that violence is actually pretty abnormal between groups. And you parse all these statistics for communal riots in India, and just war more generally. And you have this wonderful line that enemies prefer to loathe one another in peace. What is it about group violence, as different from interpersonal violence, that creates this bias toward peace in your mind?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, partly I think the good news of social science is that if we're trying to be peace builders in this world, we are not working against the grain. We're actually we're working with the grain, because there are these really powerful incentives for peace that we can harness. And so that means, a lot of people think war is easy and peace is hard. And it's not quite the opposite. War is hard, peace isn't easy, but peace is easier maybe than people think. And I think we forget that, partly because, as you say, not just the social scientists, like in the newspaper, we just don't pay so much attention to the conflicts that don't happen. We get, you page through 40 pages of Ukraine news on any given day for the last 6 or 7 months. It's very easy to miss, 2 weeks into the war on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, India accidentally lobbed a cruise missile at Pakistan, and nothing happened. And that those rivals have been at peace for most of the last 50 years, and not every day. And there's been occasional flare-ups, but for the most part, on some level, we could or should have an article every day saying, guess what? They didn't go to war. and we don't, right? But we have articles on on when we do go to war, and that's fine. It's like an emergency room doctor has to focus on the critically ill. So do we, as citizens, as peace builders. But if we forget that 999 times out of 1,000, two rivals prefer not to fight, then we do two things. One is we get demoralized, which is not good. But the second is then we misdiagnose, right? We start to trace back. Oh, we look at only the places that go to war and we trace back the events beforehand. And we say, oh, those must be the causes. They're poor. There's ancient hatreds. There's lots of guns. And those must be the causes of war. But when we trace back from the other 999 cases when they didn't go to war, often we find the same things. We will find that they're poor and that they're ancient hatreds. And so these are probably not the things. They're not irrelevant, but they're not the things that cause that war to happen. So we need to stop making that mistake. Just like we want doctors to pay attention to healthy people, because how else would they know how to diagnose and treat the sick? And so that's like the first starting message of the book.
I think it's really important, because from there you take it and you say, look, the more reasons we have for breaking this peace and going to war, the sort of smaller our ability is to avoid things that happen by chance, and that what you're really trying to do is expand your decision set so problems can arise and they're not so serious. So why don't we just jump in? You've got 5 big reasons why organized groups go to war. Do you want to rattle them off and then we'll jump into each one?
Sure. So the basic story is, okay, so why don't we fight most of the time? We don't fight because it's horrendously costly. So we look at what's going on in Ukraine. Not only is their economy shrunk by half, Russia set back 20 years. The whole world is feeling the pain. This is a powerful deterrent, and it's why India and Pakistan don't go to war, and it's why most rivals don't go to war. It's just so costly. And so the short answer to why we do fight, because I didn't write a book called Why We Don't Fight. The short answer to why we do fight is it's a reason that a society or its leaders either ignored those costs or was willing to pay them. And the thing that was surprising to me in pulling together all this social science is that even though there's millions of ways that happens, reason for every war and a war for every reason, that those logics tend to have sort of 5 different patterns. Basically, there's 5 different ways societies and leaders ignore the costs. And you could think of it as when they're not accountable, meaning they don't, the people who are deciding don't bear those costs. When we're ideological or pursuing something intangible, meaning there's something we get only from war that we can't get any other way, like glory, which we, and therefore we're willing to pay whatever cost we bear. We are biased, meaning when we make systematic mistakes about perhaps underestimating those costs or overestimating our chances of victory. When we're uncertain, which is a logic it's easier to get into with an example, but when war essentially can become a gamble and a strategic gamble. And the last one, when we believe our opponents are unreliable, when there's when there's a better deal than war, but we don't trust our opponent to stick to it, right? We think they have some strategic incentive to deviate. So there's sort of those 5, you could sort of say 3 are strategic, the unaccountability, uncertainty, and this unreliability, and then 2 are more psychological in nature. It's these ideological, intangible things and our biases.
So I want to remind people to send questions, but I'm going to jump into this first one: leaders who aren't answerable. I have 2 questions within this. First, governments for most of human history have been unanswerable. You've had centralized, personalized, unequal rulers, and fairly prone to war bias. And then as democracy is declining globally, not that democracy is conflated with more answerable leaders, we'll get that later, but as democracy is declining globally, we're seeing these forms of less accountable government rising up again. Mm-hmm. Along with a more transnational kleptocracy that really is building incentives for spoils of war and so on. I'm wondering if you think that these changes in government systems are related at all to the uptick in war over the last decade.
Potential. I think that fundamentally, as soon as you get a more autocratic system, the person in charge or the cabal in charge doesn't have to take into quite as many people's interests. And so any kind of rollback of checks and balances on an executive, any kind of rollback on downward accountability through elections is just on the margin going to mean, hey, war is just a little bit easier for me to choose, because the people who are bearing some of those costs cannot hold me accountable. They can't vote me out of office, or maybe I've cut out the powerful oligarchs and businessmen, and so I no longer have to worry about their phone calls late at night, because I've successfully insulated myself and preserved my regime. I think it's probably related. The great Philip, I think because we haven't focused enough on the role of centralized power in driving conflict, sadly, we lack a lot of hard evidence.
Mhm.
And so it's not that we have evidence for or against, we just have in some sense a failure to investigate, which I think is one of these things I'm hoping people like me can fill in the gaps. But so I'm very confident it's true, but there's no actual hard data I can point to and say, aha, this is right. Why? Because we're so distracted by studying the effects of poverty or climate change or things that are important on their own but are not necessarily driving conflict, that we are not focusing on the real important drivers.
Really, really thoughtful. One thing you don't mention in your discussion of these unanswerable leaders are leaders who aren't fully in control of their followers. And I want to press your logic here. Maybe I'm not understanding it. So here I'm thinking of splinter groups like the Real IRA, but also of smaller rebel groups where they might deal, their followers decide to go off in another direction. There's a constant problem in all sorts of warfare, but also in gang warfare.
Yeah.
So where does that fit in your theory?
So that's a great point. And that's maybe like the 102 level of the book, and which I'm not surprised we leap to right away. So listen, this whole idea of a lack of accountability of the decision makers, which is the first of the five, most of the time that's the leader, that's the president or the Politburo or whatever. The thing is that that's just one phenomenon of what like an economist or a political scientist would think of as an agency problem, meaning there's somebody who gets to make a decision and they're not accountable to the people who bear the consequences. Now, sometimes that warlord, that some sort of spoiler, that splinter group that wants to pursue war for their own interests, ignite something. That's also an agency problem. That's the thing, is they're deciding on behalf of their group to carry their group into war with some risk, and they're not being held accountable, right? And so they're not the leader, they're not the president per se, but there is that sort of agency problem. And so when groups are incohesive, and they can't sort of maintain that coalition, and a breakaway faction or a leader can go and provoke war in their interest, but against the interests of the groups. This is sort of the same general phenomenon. My colleague Wendy Perlman at Northwestern, I think, has one of the most compelling accounts of violence in Israel and Palestine. That's basically this idea. She points out that most of the time they don't fight. Right now, they prefer to loathe in peace. There's this ever-present, very low-scale violence that maybe 15 of the last 100 years of this dispute has escalated into often fairly short bursts of intense violence. And she traces a lot of those bursts to splinter groups and factions and things and basically a breaking down of the coalition on one side or the other. And so it's really a story about this kind of agency problem, and the fact that there are actors in that society that can pursue violence without being held accountable by their group.
That makes sense. Now, I appreciate that although you're an economist and you've set this up in a somewhat game theoretical manner, the book goes through bargaining theory in a lot of ways. Your second reason is intangible incentives, and you go straight back to Thucydides and the role of honor in warfare. As a disclaimer, in my game theory class in college, I almost came to blows with Vittorio Buffacchi, my teacher, a little Italian guy who was pretty hardcore on rational choice theory, and I couldn't figure out how the civil rights struggle happened based on rational choice theory.
Right.
So you bring up right away that there are these intangible incentives like glory, like honor, ideology that people will go to war for because they're getting things they can only get through warfare. And you even talk about the ecstasy of war, the kind of emotional payoff that certain aggressive individuals get from just letting loose. how do you square this? This gets back to my fight with Vittorio. How do you square this with predictive value? Because once you introduce ideology, it becomes much harder to predict when that's going to raise the stakes to the level of conflict.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'd like to stress, I might have grown up in economics, but then I spent most of my career in political science departments. So I like to straddle social sciences. And now I feel like I do as much sociology as I do either of the two. And so the book tries to bring that together. And you have to pay attention to these things that drive leaders and these things that drive societies. There's actually nothing irrational about what we desire, right? If we have an ideological attachment to liberty, or if we have an ideological attachment to national glory, that's just what we value, right? And then why is that any more valid than whether we like color televisions? Like, doesn't make any sense, right? Our preferences are preferences. We need to understand where those preferences come from. But the idea that we then act on our preferences is not very radical, right? So what are the preferences that time and time again seem to lead countries to war? Well, one of them, and maybe the obvious one, and this is the story you hear in the press about Vladimir Putin, is this pursuit of either personal or national glory. And that's undoubtedly true to some extent, right? That he is pursuing this invasion and paying these costs because he's getting something intangible that he desires, and he can get that through war. What we don't often talk about, which gets to the civil rights movement, is why is it that, I mean, most oppressed groups get a very raw deal from their autocrat, their dictator, the majoritarian group, and they don't revolt. The group that has 80% of the power gets 80% of the pie, and that feels unjust. But peace isn't always just. But occasionally, whether it's in the U.S. civil rights movement or in Ukraine, people who are getting a very small share of the pie because that's what their military and material and mobilizational might suggest they can seize, says, no way, we don't accept that. We are willing to incur some costs of war. We will fight for liberty. We will fight for this ideal. And so we have, so I think that's a very, very important driver of conflict. Now, you say predictively, like, how do we know when that's going to happen? Well, I wish I knew. So we don't talk a lot. We haven't, like, the fact that I felt I had to be the first person to kind of, maybe not the first, but one of the few people to actually try to locate this and how we think about the calculations of war and systematize what are the ones that seem empirically to come up again and again is like a start. Now, why did the Ukrainians say no way, but the Belarusians and those in Kazakhstan have said, you know what, we're going to accept this raw deal of semi-sovereignty? Why did the American civil rights movement happen when it did? I don't know. I think we have very little predictive content, and that's another big glaring hole in our understanding.
So I think I'm laying out your research program for your grad students for the next, 10, 15 years. So I want to jump in, and I'm going to conflate them because I'm looking at the time, and I want to get to answers, not just spend all of our time on the war part. But misperceptions, uncertainty, asymmetric information. These are all different ways that the facts on the ground that suggest you're going to win or lose, or how costly the conflict is going to be, are being misunderstood by the aggressor. Putin, it seems to me, is a great example of this. He saw Obama draw a line in the sand with regards to Syria. Assad crossed it with Putin's help. Nothing happened. Took some bites out of southern Ukraine. Nothing much happened. He had a U.S. president who was more pro Russia, and then he had an older man. Maybe he thought he could get away with it again. Europe's so dependent on oil and gas. So do you think that that's a fairer explanation than this ideological explanation for what's going on with Putin in this war?
I think it's one we underestimate, especially in the press. So you hear this ideological explanation. That was bucket 2 of why we fight. Bucket 3 is the other thing you hear in the press, which is the misperceptions. Here's an isolated, insulated leader who has bad information and just made a bad call. Also surely true to some extent. But in order for you to have bad information and to make a mistake, there has to be uncertainty around what the status is. Like, will the West be unified? Right? 7 months ago, who knew? How strong is the Ukrainian military? 7 months ago, who knew? How strong is the Russian military? Well, almost everyone's been surprised. And so there's this, I like to point us to this fourth bucket. I say, yes, let's accept, like, I dive a lot into trying to systematize how we understand the misperceptions that drive leaders and societies to war. In this case, I think we have to step back and say, actually, maybe this wasn't completely just a mistake and bad information. Maybe there was just a general environment of uncertainty where the resolve of the US and the West and Ukraine was fundamentally in doubt. And the idea that Russia would get a bad draw on Western unity, on Russian military strength and Ukrainian strength and pluckiness was within the realm of possibility. Nobody predicted it, least of all Vladimir Putin. So amidst this uncertainty, there's a large capacity to make something that ex ante is the right decision, ex post is the wrong one. And then we sort of love to sort of decry that is a mistake, but it might have actually been an optimal strategy under the uncertainty, especially because, and this is, I get into the book, this is where this becomes a strategic story, is when there's uncertainty, you don't trust the other side's protestations that actually they're quite strong and resolved, right? You can't trust it. You're worried that they're bluffing. And so anyone who's ever played poker gets this, right? If you don't know each other's hands, your optimal strategy is not to bluff none of the time, and it's not to bluff all of the time. It's to bluff some of the time. And in response to that uncertainty, your optimal strategy is not to fold all the time, and it's not to call all the time. It's to call some of the time. And so the same logic sort of helps us understand amidst this uncertainty, how it's possible, how your optimal strategy is actually to invade with some probability some of the time. And this is a really important driver of war at so many levels, and we don't talk about it.
It's also why reputation matters so much. And you do talk in the book about how Saddam Hussein tried to keep up the misperception that he had these chemical weapons right up until the end, because his reputation with the regional powers that could affect him was worth so much that he was willing to hope that the West wouldn't really do anything right up to the end.
Uncertainty creates this opportunity for an actor to create reputation by doing things that are warlike or potentially even going to war. So let's use an American example. Why did the United States stay in Afghanistan for 20 years? There are lots of reasons for that. There were intelligence failures, so kind of misperception. There was a desire for vengeance and capturing Osama bin Laden in particular. So that was vengeance. That's a story of ideological or intangible incentives. But there's a story of uncertainty and reputation, which is to say that the world is not sure how resolved the United States is. And staying and fighting, even when losing, is a way of signaling resolve and deterring future enemies. So every time any US policymaker thought, we cannot leave now, in 2006 or 2008 or 2010, especially as things are getting worse for us. If we leave now, what signal will that send to insert, terror group or international rival here, right? That's a worry about reputation. Amidst uncertainty, what signal will we send to them about our resolve? Just like now, if we allow, Vladimir Putin to get away with X, and X might be a nuclear threat or this shaving off of the Donbass or whatever, what message will that send to China? What message will that send to somebody else? That's a story about there's uncertainty about the resolve and the capabilities of the West, and that will lead people to take advantage and do warlike things in future. So we need to stop this now. And so you might not like that logic, but you have to understand it.
Absolutely. I think that is a particular issue that gets discounted by people who don't think about and study war. Or guns for that matter. And they like to decry reputation as kind of a bunch of old white men in suits sitting around worrying about their status. And it's not at all that. And I wanted you to pull on that thread a little bit. So the last point you make is commitment problems. And I really want to delve into this with regards to China. You quote the Chinese general Sun Tzu in The Art of War saying, there's never been a protracted war from which a country has benefited. But there's this commitment problem with rising powers where, Thucydides, as you write, was the rise of Athens and the fear this inspired in Sparta that made war inevitable. This sense that there's a rising power. Mm-hmm. It's not risen. You could still keep it down if you attacked first. No one really wants war. But if you let it get too big, the declining power is going to lose its moment. And this has inspired a lot of war over the years. In fact, the handoff between the UK and the US during and after World War II might be one of the very few cases of a rising power not sparking war. And that may have had to do with the quick consolidation of the Soviet Union at that moment and the sudden threat. Now, you say in your book that this is a little too simple, that a rising power is really only a problem if your other four issues are out of whack, or other four reasons are out of whack. But I'd love for you to talk about this issue of commitment problems, how you deal with the rising power, and how you think we should be dealing with this situation.
So yeah, so the idea is that if there's, as you say, if you anticipate an adversary getting much more powerful, you have an opportunity to lock in your advantage today by invading and curbing that from happening. Now, there's an alternative, which is wars, that's going to be extraordinarily costly. So you'd like to avoid that at all costs. You'd like to sort of cut a deal with that adversary and say, look, you're going to have more of the pie, but I want you to at least preserve some of my influence once you've risen. And actually, most of the time, that's what happens. I mean, the world has managed China going from an economic and military backwater to being the largest economy in the world, and maybe one day soon the largest military. And that has not been violent so far. And there's nothing preordained to say that this is going to happen in future. There's a few flashpoints that have more to do with a very specific dispute over the status of Taiwan, and that's of course related to the rise of China, but it's not fundamentally driven by the rise of China. And so again, I think there's this tendency to pay attention to all of the rising powers that did lead to war, and then not pay attention to the great power rises that did not lead to war. And so I think when we do, we sort of see that this isn't just we're not just fated to go to war against a rising power like China. In fact, most of the time in history, that's been avoided. And why? Because war is just horrendously costly for both sides. It's not really in our interest to do so.
Now, I want to turn to prescriptions. I also want to encourage people to send in questions. Now we're at the halfway point. And thank you, Savannah, to participate in today's Q&A, post in the YouTube chat. But we're going to turn now to prescriptions. So these are the 5 main reasons that you see war, that you see gang violence and organized criminal violence. What can you do about them? One thing you say in the book, it's got all these beautiful lines, that's why I keep quoting them. Chance events matter only when the fundamentals have left rivals with little room to maneuver. And you have this great metaphor of someone trying to fly a plane through a canyon. It's much easier to fly in the open skies. You can have a lot of mistakes and you're okay. In a canyon, there's a lot less room to maneuver. So part of what we're talking about is, okay, how do you give potentially unstable rivals more room to maneuver so that you're sort of taking the stakes down, you're pulling down the walls of this canyon. And one of the first things you write about is the problem of unconstrained, over-centralized rule. One of our questioners writes about the Political Instability Task Force, which also talks about centralized rule and unchecked executives being a big problem. So what's your prescription here? And to put more of a point on it, I've spent a lot of my professional life supporting democracy as well as working on violence, seeing that as the political system that offers a container for ferocious differences to be resolved without cutting people's lives short and stunning their chances. But plenty of democracies have really outsized violence, especially Latin America. And you're very careful to talk about checks and balances and not talk about democracy. So I'd love for you to unpack how you check and balance power, and also what the distinction is between that and democracy per se.
Yeah. So, okay. So like a centralized leader who gets to choose to go to war without consulting the vast majority of his or her, citizens is obviously unaccountable. That's one of our 5. But that person, we're also then vulnerable to their intangible or ideological objectives. We're vulnerable to their misperceptions, which are often accentuated in these isolated, insulated autocracies. I think having to personalize power can grow uncertainty. And then by definition, less checked regimes, especially autocrats, can't really make credible commitments. So we get this sort of commitment problem and unreliability. So this centralized power makes all 5 worse. And so the question is, what do you do about that? And I think there's this knee-jerk reaction that says we should have elections and everyone should be a democracy, and then we'd have less war. And to some degree, that's true. I think that that's a means to hold leaders accountable. But I don't know that it's like the first nor necessarily the most likely to happen in the short run in a lot of places. But I think what can happen is that power that central cabal can be checked. So there can be a business elite, right? So crony capital, like a politburo is better than a personalized dictatorship, and a crony capitalism is better than a politburo, and on and on and on. There are lots of ways to check power. Likewise, but that's like sort of being checked laterally. Likewise, a country that has a lot of regionalism, that has decentralized a lot of governance downwards to other local autocrats. That's the kind of check and balance. And then countries that have signed on to treaties or trade unions or currency unions or the World Trade Organization, all of these are checks and balances on power. And so I think we need to think in what, Eleanor Ostrom called a polycentric way, which is to say to sort of be checked and balanced in many, many directions. And for a long time, that's what gave me a lot of hope about China and the low probability of war with any neighbor, is that this is, although an autocracy, this was a highly checked and balanced regime in all of these polycentric ways. And of course, as Vladimir Putin reversed that over the last 20 years and personalized power in Russia, this is what worries me about China, is the gradual attempt and some success at personalizing power and reducing those checks and balances. And that to me is the number one thing in the world that contributes to instability, is concentration of power in Xi Jinping.
I think that's true. I think it's also very important to recognize that there are all these steps pre-democracy or sort of to the side of democracy that just aren't getting explored, because morally speaking, we're not allowed to say that a corrupt elite is better than an autocratic single person rule. But in fact, there are tough choices that might need to be made, and that might need to be made fairly quickly with regards to China, frankly. Now, you talk about checks and balances being better, but in the US, it seems to me that checks and balances are making commitment problems more problematic. So, in North Korea, Clinton passes a treaty, makes various promises. The Senate doesn't follow through. In Iran, we pass a treaty, then we pull out. It seems to me that these commitment problems within the US are really caused in part by the number of checks and balances. And I'm just wondering if you agree, and if so, if you think that that's sort of an added twist on what you're discussing.
So on the one hand, you could imagine that one answer is that there isn't a popular consensus towards whatever this commitment that some elite negotiating with Iran or whoever it might be doesn't want to make. And so there's not a commitment problem because of some dysfunction, but simply because that commitment doesn't represent the interests of the group. And so the commitment problem is really just coming from from the democratic process functioning. Now, that's maybe a little bit of a stretch, right? You could also argue that there's actually some dysfunction in our radical news. There's some dysfunction in our democratic system, right? We're actually, if anything, the United States might be the one nation on the planet that's probably 10 or 20% too checked and balanced. And this contributes to a degree of dysfunction that makes it very hard to make credible deals. I think there's something to that. And so maybe there's some optimal level of checks and balances. And of course, so I don't want to say there's no other kind of institutional dysfunction that doesn't inhibit deal making. Of course, that's true. If on average in the world today, on average in the last, 10,000 years of human history, do I think too much checks and balances and too much democratic dysfunction is like the main thing going on and driving war? No, it's just not. It's the opposite, right? And so if only we lived in a world where we're 10 or 20% too checked and balanced and thus had that dysfunction, that would be a glorious world to live in.
Yes, agreed. And, one thing that we're doing sometimes through our aid infrastructure is the opposite. So, if you're talking about decentralizing economic as well as political power, and then the development machine basically starts pouring money, but also meetings and attention at this one centralized level because it's easier. It strikes me that is pushing in the opposite direction. Is that also something that?
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, our entire diplomatic and development apparatus internationally is designed to basically give people in the center more influence. Now, that's not true of everything the rich world does in low and middle income countries, right? So if if Give Directly is dropping money out of helicopters or onto mobile phones, right? That's not going through the finance ministry. That's very decentralizing in some ways, to the extent that, every poor person in Kenya is twice as wealthy as a result of some guaranteed basic income that they're getting from wealthy people abroad. That's probably going to increase their economic power vis-a-vis the government. They're less likely to sell their vote. Kids are more literate. You can imagine a chain of events where that actually shifts bargaining power out of the center to the periphery. So that's a great example. And I think lots of school building programs, lots of things one does, roads, industrialization policy, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, enabling a place like Kenya to export textiles. All these things are, I think, in a check and balance power. At the same time, we could run those exact same programs, and you could channel all the cash transfers to the Ministry of Finance, and then all the provinces have to come begging. Or you can channel all the decision-making authority for all the school building and the literacy programs through the Minister of Education. And there's something legitimate to that, because this is a democratic government. At the same time, you are shifting the power balance in that society, and you're basically making everyone come to that central elite with like a little bowl to get their school or to get their cash transfer and their basic income. And we should be aware that that's actually concentrating power in that society and potentially making it more fragile. And so let's be conscious of this at the very least, and make those. But right now it's this hidden thing that we do that most people don't even think about. We're like, well, we're just doing a technical program. We're building skills. This isn't a political program. Well, every program is a political program in this respect, and every program shapes fragility because it shapes the power of the elite versus the rest of society in one direction or the other.
Absolutely. And the thinking, working politically groups that I've been a part of have been trying to hammer this home. But it's really, what you're saying is, it's really the how as well as the what, that the exact same program can be run in a way that's more politically aware and thus more fragility aware. And I think that's an important lesson. On the other hand, some attempts at decentralization don't seem to decrease conflict. I'm thinking here, or maybe I'm wrong about that. Let me just think out loud for a minute. Kenya in 2007 had an awful election with a great deal of violence. They immediately had constitutional reform. They devolved a lot of power to states and counties, or sort of the equivalent of counties. And they haven't had quite as violent an election since, but they have had a lot more localized violence that seems to be around the spoils at the local and state level. That isn't as bad, and it doesn't make the news as much because it's not as bad. But what do you make of that trade-off, that once you devolve power and devolve economic power, there's a lot more places for small fights to break out?
Yeah, so I would say you make a massive change like that, and you can imagine there's some short-term disequilibrium. So it's possible that whatever change you make, for the better or for the worse, there'll be some scrambling because the spoils are potentially large. So we shouldn't only look at the short-term effects of something like this and try to generalize too much. I think the potential for violence is somewhat less. The problem with the Kenyan reform, which I think looked great initially, was that it actually really centralized power regionally. So there's no more real mayors, and there's very little local decision making at, say, a city or town level any longer. And so it's really created these superpower sort of governor-like figures. And so they're like lots of mini centralized governments. So I guess that's maybe a slight improvement over a hyper centralized presidential system, which is what most sub-Saharan African countries, including Kenya, for a long time had. So it's a little bit like less of a winner take all. Now there's just dozens of winner take all games. But that's maybe that's not the way, that's a check and balance, but maybe not as dramatic as a lot of people claim it is in the Kenyan case.
That makes sense. And it gets to these ideas that you really draw out in the peace mediation section, that peace mediators, you come down very positively about them. And you talk a lot about how these folks who are kind of bringing everyone to the table and forcing facilitation and really forcing, punishing and enforcing and incentivizing and socializing, all of these different ways that peace mediation works, has really been a useful way to bring down violence.
Mhm.
I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit, and then particularly in response to one of our audience questions, talk about the different forms of coercion that get used as kind of peace mediation.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a good example of where I think we can learn about, mediation and its efficacy at like the international level by looking at how mediation works at a lower level. We think, I mean, in principle, mediators should be terrific at helping solve some of these 5 problems, right? They're mediators trying to reduce uncertainty. A mediator is trying to find clever ways to solve the commitment problem and deals that will work. And they're basically trying to eliminate misperceptions. They're trying to get bargainers to basically act like the rational beings in the models and not have these misperceptions or these emotional outbursts, right? So there's a lot of management of the personalities. They're also trying to solve this splinter group problem. They're trying to basically help the coalitions cohere. And so they're kind of solving some of the accountability problems as well, when they work. But then do mediators work? Well, how do you evaluate that? It's extraordinarily difficult. And there's a cute example that I talk in the book of, one of my students and colleagues looked at the fact that peace truces are breaking out all the time in the world. Every day there's a peace truce breaking out somewhere. But if your truce breaks out in July or August, you're much more likely to get a mediator because all the European and American parliamentarians and Congress people are on holiday, and they are more likely to take it up. So you're much more likely to get a peace mediator. That truce is actually a little bit more durable. A lot of my work has been at the village level, at the subnational level. Right now, I'm trying to do some studies of mediation between gangs, where we can run randomized controlled trials, or where we can have big samples and we can actually show that mediators work and why, and actually demonstrate with real numbers that actually you bring in mediators, you bring in these skills, and you solve these 5 problems, and you get much more durable peace, right? It's not a magic solution, but it sort of contributes in a really meaningful way, and it's not that expensive. And so do we generalize from a gang mediator or a village mediator up to like Ukraine? No, but does this provide some comfort that this is like a really important international intervention when there's zero evidence otherwise? Absolutely.
Now, one thing about mediators at the state level that is different than mediators at the gang level is that they tend to centralize power again at the state level in a way that's not true at the village or gang level, because they have to talk with a certain number of people, and who's in the room is who's going to get the spoils after that peace treaty. So how do you deal with that opposing effect of the peace mediation at the national level?
Yeah, I mean, and it goes a little bit back to this comment on coercion. I mean, the fact is that what we're talking about every dispute or every contest between 2 sides is one where each side is trying to use all of its available influence and power, its military power, its economic might, its ability to put people on the streets to get its way. And so that can involve a lot of coercive power. And so just as I said, peace isn't just, because it can lead to if there's an unequal distribution of power, there's going to be an unequal distribution of whatever the spoils are. But also, like, those sides are often free to use a great deal of coercion. All right. And if that's a particularly unequal side within that group, right, peace can often mean entrenching the power of the powerful, at least temporarily, right? That's might still be fragile because these very centralized systems are more likely to be violent in the long run. But yeah, the way you turn off a conflict sometimes is making it interests of the people holding the guns and holding all the money, basically finding a way for them to find their way back to the world where they're making more money in peace. And so it's a sort of dark side. So for me, like, I think any kind of peace agreement that's sort of going to thinking far into the future, on the one hand, you want to be acknowledging this darker side and recognizing that you have to sort of make peace pay today for those elites. And then you want to be really laser focused on what are the little things that can happen in that peace agreement, what could be negotiated that in the longer run sort of will check and balance those powers, right? So and I think, and there are, this would be a longer conversation, but I think there are a lot of points of leverage in terms of what kind of economic and trade regime is set up, and who's that going to empower over the long run? What kind of constitutional rules are set up, and actually how can maybe the short-term myopic incentives of some elites be harnessed such that like the interests of like the masses and the larger group can sort of be secured in the longer run by giving the elite something in the short run. And that's a little bit Machiavellian because you're sort of making these decisions on other people's behalf, but at that level, I just don't know what any better way to do that, at least as an outsider.
I've been working on a paper actually for a long time because I just keep putting it on the back burner about a Texas two-step sort of way of peace negotiating where you acknowledge that you need to get the people to the table who have guns. You need to give them a reason to stay at the table and put down the guns. And that tends to require giving them outsized power in the end result. And yet you need to decentralize power, economic and political. And so you need this kind of Texas two-step where the first step of the peace negotiation is giving the leaders what they want, but you need some form of tripwire down the line that removes some of that power. And what would that actually look like if we started thinking about these deals in kind of multiple times rather than a single peace negotiation and then a failure of a peace negotiation, but saw it as multiple steps. We have a question about, is there a difference between peace mediation and peace negotiation?
So that's actually, when one of the big experiments I ran on improving negotiation and mediation was in villages in Liberia, where there's hostilities between ethnic groups, religious groups, and just amongst neighbors. And you can think of as negotiation is when the two parties to a dispute are solving this themselves. And mediation is when a third party is coming in and trying to help them resolve it. And so those are obviously distinctive for that reason. They, the thing they have in common, when the intervention I studied was basically saying, listen, there's going to be a mix of all three. There's a general set of skills and norms that are going to facilitate parties to a dispute either negotiating themselves or being mediated more effectively by whoever's nearby. It could be the ethnic leader or the religious leader. And so, the absent a mediator so it's great to have a mediator with the skills to sort of help you reduce uncertainty, find clever commitment, solve solutions to commitment problem, solve misperceptions. But it's even better if we have a generalized set of norms about what are appropriate standards of behavior in a dispute. When can't you use violence? What are appropriate standards of behavior for choosing a forum? What are appropriate standards of behavior for sticking to a deal once you've acknowledged it? And how can the community enforce those collectively? And so it really focused on a set of norms and rules and collective agreements that would help disputants find deals and then stick to them, whether they negotiated it or mediated in that village. So they're kind of mutually enforced by, I think, a set of social things and then what we found was that there was no change in disputes after 1 or 2 or 3 years in these villages, but they were about 30 or 40% less likely to turn violent. The people were resolving them quicker and more quickly and more peacefully. And
I have to say, not to make light of that, I thought that was a particularly interesting finding in the book. It made me think of my first grader, or my now second graders class, and the social and economic. Sorry, you'll see that my mind is skipping between places. Yeah. The social and emotional learning that they do now for little kids, and that a lot of it is basically cognitive behavioral therapy, watered down for small children. And part of what you were talking about in Liberia is cognitive behavioral therapy brought into a more community context and less individualized, but people are taught how to do these things, and then they're more institutionalized ways of building it. And it really struck me that these are ways in which you, just as young children are prone to fighting it out physically, if you have a society in which the kind of watchdogs have broken down that keep people from fighting it out physically, exploring that social and emotional learning is really an important part of peace.
No, absolutely. I mean, all of within a society or even between societies, whenever we collectively agree on a set of rules, informal rules for appropriate standards of behavior, that's often inherently peacemaking, right? Because it's sort of, we're cutting off certain violations of the commitment problem, certain kinds of unaccountability, certain misperceptions, certain emotional responses. And it's basically just pushing everybody, giving that little incentive, because you're not going to be sanctioned with like official sanctions. You're going to be sanctioned with praise and shame. And those are very powerful. And so those social norms are powerful. And then when we instill certain skills, when we actually help everybody emotionally regulate a little bit better, and when we help them share information and talk in ways that actually elicit more information and don't make us defensive, actually, again, incrementally helps us solve all these disputes by avoiding misperceptions and uncertainty. And that's not just true of like schoolyard disputes. You'll talk to someone who's sitting at the table with Israel and Palestine and their leaders, and they're doing exactly the same thing. They're using those language tricks, use your I statements. They're trying to instill some of those socioeconomic skills. They're doing a little bit of mini CBT with these guys because that's what's necessary at all of these levels. And I think and none of them are magic solutions, but they get us a little bit incrementally closer towards peace, again, by solving these 5 problems.
Absolutely. Now, we only have 4 minutes left, and I want to jump into the United States because I've been spending a lot of my time on U.S. political violence. And if you want to look at a society where social and emotional learning seems to be breaking down, it strikes me that the U.S. is losing ground on a lot of these 5 points. And I wanted to explore that with you, that we have a lot of leaders who aren't answerable to the people willing to bear the cost. These are your militias, your QAnon groups, and so on, the kind of splinter groups that I was talking about. These intangible incentives of dominance and a sense of identity playing a very strong role in politics versus the more economic and sort of solvable interests. A lot of asymmetric information with a sort of echo chamber on the right saying, they're taking your guns, this is happening. We had a whole article on the Flight 93 election in 2016 that this was going to be the last election unless you rushed the cockpit and elected Trump because they were going to take away the election. Now you hear the same rhetoric on the left that each election is going to be the last election. And so that's a sort of classic commitment problem. And then, of course, the misperceptions. There's been numerous articles about the misperceptions of both sides and what they actually want, and that those misperceptions are strongest among the most political elites on the left and the right. But the people who are driving the train have the least clear understanding of the other side. So one thing that you write about and that I know about as well is that the lack of grouping actually makes violence more likely, that individual violence is more likely than group violence because there's no one to hold you back. And so I'm wondering about, with regard to the United States and political violence, whether you're concerned based on your analysis and whether you think our listeners should be.
Right. Well,
2 minutes.
Yeah, the answer, I guess I used to think the answer was there's zero chance of large-scale political violence in the US, and now I think it's very unlikely. So that's terrifying, right? And I think you and I are very similar in this respect. Or at least your writings have been influential to me as well, and have helped me figure out where I land. So I think there's really powerful incentives for these politicians not to pursue violence systematically and on a large scale. I think those incentives are so powerful that that's extraordinarily unlikely. What I worry about are these splinter groups and these factions captured by ideologies and misperceptions, creating sort of what amounts to like an awful lot of political violence at this, not well organized by the political parties. And I think it was you who at some point I read or I found very powerful. I said how there are all these social norms. We just described all these social norms and socio-emotional skills that are violence reducing, that have perpetrated. And I do worry about there becoming certain social norms of political protests that are more embracing of violence or more permissive of violence, or where violence is part of the normal repertoire, that if I am angry, this somehow I now think that this is the normal thing for me to try to organize, even if it's with my little group of friends. It's somehow the appropriate thing is to like set off a bomb. And that's the kind of thing. So that's not large scale organized political violence, which I think is extremely rare. I sort of worry about an erosion of these social norms that we've had against violence, and actually the opposite coming up. And that could be really entrenching and really, really problematic.
Sure. We saw some of that in the 60s and 70s, really, with those social norms eroding. Well, we're out of time, but I think that was a fabulous exploration, Chris, of the book and of your thinking. I clearly want in book 3, and I'm pushing in those directions with you and your grad students, but I hope our listeners do check out book 1 because it's really beautifully written and really different from most of the normal fare. So thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having me.